Well, thank you everybody for coming. We're going to discuss or scrutinize the aid industry tonight on the basis of two fantastic books that are out here. One, War Games, The Story of Aid, War in Modern Times by Linda Polman, and by Conor Foley, The Thin Blue Line, How Humanitarianism Went to War. Both the authors are here. They don't exactly agree with each other, which we're going to play out on the panel a bit, and we've got two very expert people to analyze what they're saying. Sarah Bailey, who's with the Overseas Development Institute, and Amani Abuzaid, who's with Action Aid. All of the panel here have worked in the most difficult and dangerous places, and all have got intricate knowledge of, I think, what is one of the biggest issues of our time, particularly since 9/11, which is how to fix a failed state. And the stakes are very high now, so getting aid right means getting our foreign policy right and getting the future right. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask both the authors to encapsulate their theses for a few minutes. We'll get analysis from the other two panelists, and then from time to time, if you've got a question to ask on the issues that are being discussed, just put up your hand and we'll run the question with the debate. So, Linda, perhaps you would be good enough.
Yes, I
Thank
would
you.
be. Thank you very much. My name is Linda Polman. I'm a freelance journalist from Holland. I work for Dutch newspapers. Sometimes I'm also asked to do something for English newspapers, for example. For years I have been covering UN peacekeeping operations. I also wrote a book about that, We Did Nothing. For the past couple of years I've been watching what humanitarian aid operations do, because they are in the same areas as the blue helmet soldiers were, which I covered for a couple of years. And I published this book in Dutch in 2008 called The Crisis Caravan. It was translated into English as the War Games, and it came out about 2 weeks ago. I'll take a few minutes to make my argument, in which I will also talk a little bit about our role, the role of the media inside what I call this being locked in a cycle of mutual support. And there are three parties involved in my book, which is the humanitarian industry, the aid organizations and their donors. It's the media, which is us, or most of us, and it's the warmongers, the people who are actually there involved in their own fight against each other. Now, the question I ask in this book is, should the international aid organizations, should they carry on doggedly to provide relief if those warring factions use aid for their own benefit and thus prolong the fighting? Because aid is goods and aid is cash, and you can actually pocket that, or you can exchange it or sell it for guns. Let me tell you a little bit about how the aid industry came into being. From the 80s on, it actually industrialized. There's now an average of 1,000 aid organizations per what they call humanitarian zone. 1,000, and those humanitarian zones are actually quite small. It is one city, or it is one province, or it is the environment of where refugee camps are. So 1,000 organizations there, but in a place like Afghanistan, the last count there was about 2,300 aid organizations, all together in Kabul, most of them. And then there's the money. That's $120 billion per year involved, and that's only the official development aid given by our governments. And on top of that, there's about 10%, 12 billion, 10 billion, that differs from year to year. What we give for humanitarian aid, which is the emergency aid operations in places like Darfur and in a place like Haiti, for example, at this moment. And then there's also the private fundraising. It's the tenners that we take out of our pockets and we give to the people who are asking for it, the fundraising in the streets, the fundraising in our companies. And that's an unknown amount of money, but we have to presume that that's another hundreds of millions of pounds and dollars per year. And then there is these 37,000 international aid organizations following that flow of money, and they are in competition with each other for that money. Now, so aid is a business for those aid organizations, but it's also a business for the warring partners, the warring parties, the money and the supplies of aid organizations are a business opportunity, and they are also part of the military strategy of those parties. People who are at war, they want to win that war, they'll do anything. They will also abuse aid to win that war. They will see to it that they themselves get as much as possible and that their enemy gets as little as possible of that aid. So aid is in fact an instrument of war. Now, there's the World Food Programme, for example. Their director is called Nicholas Stockton, and he said there's a market for good works, and it is big business. He said, call it the moral economy. So that is what we are talking about. Organizations, they all have their own aid organizations, they all have their own agendas, they all have their own goals, they all have their own institutional survival techniques, and they are good at product positioning, and they are good at proposal development. And their CEOs, they could work for any company, not necessarily. They are trained in third world knowledge, but they are more trained in marketing and in competition, for example. Now, it is not only the aid organizations who are in competition with each other, it is also the victims who are in competition for the attention of the aid organizations. Also for the victim, aid is a business because aid is necessary in a war. It is an instrument of war. To attract attention, of course, the best way is through us. It is through the media. The coverage of a disaster, the coverage of you being a victim of, or of you being an aid organization, the coverage on TV is essential. For example, Boutros Ghali would always refer, he was the former Secretary General of the United Nations, he would always refer to CNN as the 16th member of the Security Council. He said that without attention of CNN, disaster victims would not get any attention from the donor governments. And there's a link between publicity and the donor interest, and the link has been there always. 1968, Hungary, Biafra, I was a child in that time. There was, on one hand, the American president, Lyndon Johnson, who saw the famine in Biafra on TV, and he would say, get those goddamn nigger babies off my TV screen, because he was afraid that all that attention would force him to go there in a military way and stop the famine. He didn't want that. It was Lyndon Johnson against the man who was actually creating the famine, Colonel Ojukwu, a Biafran, and he was actually, to get the goddamn nigger babies on the TV screen, he was actually hiring a PR firm in Geneva to get that done. And that PR firm in Geneva actually got the journalists into Biafra. They got their pictures, and it was those pictures that started these enormous fundraising campaigns for that. Ever since then, warmongers have been using the media, they have been using public relations to promote their causes. The more media attention, the more income for the NGOs. NGOs are forced to participate in this competition for attention, because if you don't do it as an organization, your competitor organization will do it, and the circus would simply go on without you. Same thing goes for the warmongers. Aid is like a lottery, is what the humanitarian coordinator of the United Nations said, Jan Egeland. Aid is like a lottery. You have 25 equally desperate communities taking part of this lottery for attention every week. 24 of these communities lose, 1 wins. So in this lottery, the victims also have to find a way to distinguish themselves from rival victims. Now, and here's what the logic of the humanitarian era is in which we live. The logic is that if you want the attention, if you want to make it on CNN, if you want the attention of the donors, you will have to produce the images that we journalists demand. You will have to produce the images of the starving babies, and you will have to produce the babies so we can make the images of. And this is what is the terrible logic of the area that we live in. As a victim, you do not exist without the media attention. And I believe that we as journalists should all reconsider our part in this terrible mutual cycle of being locked in our business interest, the interest of the aid organizations, the interest of the victims who need the attention, and the interest of the media who need the images. This is, in short, my argument. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to sum up there, Linda, you're saying, you've laid out your view of it, but is it totally flawed? Does it need a complete overhaul?
Well,
or is it just the way you see it?
Well, we have a serious problem. I mean, nobody will deny that there's a link between donor attention, and there's a link between fundraising and media attention. Nobody will deny that we live in a media age. You need your 20 minutes of fame on the screen, otherwise you do not exist. So to get on that screen, you have to be more interesting than somebody else. I have to be more interesting than other journalists to get on TV. But victims also have to be more interesting than other victims. Okay. And it's 25 victim groups per week that compete for that attention, and only one can win.
Okay, Conor Foley, just your book is in a slightly different area, but there's a lot of overlap there, isn't it? Can you give us your thesis?
Well, first of all, to say thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to Linda. It's always nice when a book comes out and having it in front of you. I've read it, although I read it quite rapidly because I only got it a couple of days ago. But I remember about 15 years ago reading an extract from Linda's last book about Rwanda, or which mentioned Rwanda. There was a very powerful extract about the killing fields when Tutsi soldiers surrounded a refugee in terms of the displacement camp and massacred refugees. And that was one of the things I read at the time, going back 15 years, which really did actually open my eyes to the complexities of humanitarianism and how it's not a black and white issue, and how basically it's shades of grey. I'm going to speak for slightly less time than Linda. We were told to keep to 1 to 2 minutes, so I think 15 is probably over that.
Amani was told to speak for 5 minutes.
Chaos, total chaos. It's just like a humanitarian aid operation.
There you go. Linda, an extra on that tomorrow, huh?
You have to get the attention, yes.
Any screens around.
But I'd also like to actually to open it up very much to the floor, because I know just from seeing friends and colleagues here, there's people who've worked in Afghanistan, in Darfur, someone who's I think is going back to Afghanistan in a couple of days' time. And given that Linda's book has created quite a media sensation and is, I think it's fair to say, polemically critical of the aid industry, but also people working in the aid industry in quite a personalised way, I think it'd be nice to draw them in to open that discussion. So I just want to, in 2 minutes, talk about my background and my own book, which was published in hardback at the end of 2008 and is coming out in paperback in a couple of weeks' time. My name's Conor Foley. I've spent the last 20 years working either, well, for the first 10 years in human rights organisations, first in Northern Ireland and then working for Amnesty International here in London. I had responsibility in the UK section of Amnesty International for our work on impunity, that is bringing war criminals to justice, an issue that Linda touches on. And that was around the time in 1998 when the International Criminal Court was being negotiated, and also when Augusto Pinochet came to Britain and was arrested on the foot of a Spanish extradition warrant. People might also remember that was the day in which Pinochet lost his sovereign immunity in the House of Lords' famous judgment of 24th of March 1999, was also the day that NATO began its operations over Kosovo as a result of the humanitarian crisis there. I went out to Kosovo to do some training in refugee camps during the conflict basically on how to catch war criminals and how to use international human rights and humanitarian law to bring war criminals to justice. And then went into Kosovo itself in, I think, July or August of 1999, just as Pristina was taken over by NATO troops. After that, I was seconded to work for the UN High Commission for Refugees in Kosovo as a protection officer in 2000-2001. I was in Kosovo on 9/11 and went out to Afghanistan, where I spent a year and a half setting up a network of legal aid agencies across the country, helping returning refugees primarily with land and property problems. I left Kosovo in 2004, and for the last 6 years now, I've been working as a consultant, doing some work for ODI, doing lots of work for different humanitarian agencies, some work for the UN as well. and also a little bit of writing, sometimes for The Guardian, and the result of which, the book that was published, The Thin Blue Line, How Humanitarianism Went to War. And I think that the subtitle of the book is the subject of the book. It's an analysis of how humanitarianism found itself involved in conflicts, and how humanitarian agencies ended up advocating foreign invasions of countries, and agencies on the ground ended up collaborating in counterinsurgency operations where foreign military troops had been stationed in those countries. And there's a paradox, of course, that agencies which are set up to do good and to help people find themselves operating in political and operational tandem with military forces. And so the book's an analysis of how that happened and what the consequences of that have been for humanitarian aid workers. And secondly, looking at the ideologically, I describe the shift away from traditional neutral humanitarianism, the idea that you help people in order to save lives. The humanitarian imperative is that if people are starving, you should get aid to them. If people are dying for want of medical neglect or lack of shelter, you should try to help them. To this view of a more politicized version of humanitarianism, that humanitarians should fulfill certain political objectives, and which I think we've seen how that has been, I describe it as political humanitarianism and how it arose. But I think the consequences, or the most dramatic consequences of that, were the purloining of political humanitarianism and its combining with the neoconservative agenda in the aftermath of 9/11 to form what became known as the theory of liberal interventionism, the policy of, I'm going to say the last Labour government, I don't know if we say the Labour government, and closely identified with our former Prime Minister Tony Blair and is he our Foreign Secretary or is he the future leader of the Labour Party, David Miliband, who actually quite clearly said in one of his keynote speeches that neoconservatism had liberated many countries from fascist dictatorships. So I, as many people concerned with the situation in Iraq, was interested in how those combinations how had we as humanitarian agencies found ourselves in this politicized world. And I think really my starting point is much the same as Linda's, much the same I think as most people in the room. We understand what the problems are. We understand aid is misused. We understand there's a big aid industry. We understand billions are spent. We understand lots of that gets misused. But what do you do about it? And I think here Linda and I are diametrically opposed. And I say that with all due respect to Linda. I understand the validity of the position that she's arguing. The idea that if you give aid to people, if you put aid into conflict zones, some of it is going to be misused, undeniably. Equally, if you do not put aid into conflict zones where people are starving to death, they will die. And that's the dilemma. And I've worked in high-profile conflict zones where aid has been given, and I've seen it being wasted, after tsunami, for example. But I've also worked in countries which haven't got aid, and where larger numbers of people have died. And I think that's the dilemma. And it's no good saying we should ask questions or we should weigh these up or no is an option. You have to make a decision. In the ideal world, we would like aid to be used properly and given to the most needy, the most deserving. But getting humanitarian assistance into conflict zones is messy, it's complicated, it involves compromises. But if you don't do it, more people will die. I think that's, to my mind, after 20 years in the industry and a lot of time thinking about it, that seems to be the basic moral dilemma, the basic moral decision that we have to make. Having said which, one thing I think is good about Linda's book is that the publication stimulates events like this and that we can come together and discuss it, because I think there is a need for far more discussion. Organisations like the Overseas Development Humanitarian Policy Group is one of the few organisations that actually does the intellectual spade work on what is the effect of humanitarian aid. Linda said something, made a throwaway comment at the beginning saying that aid prolongs conflict. There's no empirical evidence of that. I've yet to see any evidence that at a macro level, putting aid into war zones actually does prolong conflict. Maybe it's true, but someone needs to research it. And I think that seems to be, there's a whole series of myths, misconceptions, half-baked ideas, and perhaps some true things in there that we need to really study, think about, debate. So on that basis, I'd like to welcome the opportunity for this, thank Linda for participating in the debate, thank my fellow my co-participants, and also look forward to discussing it more with you.
Conor, thank you. Just to clarify one point there about getting aid into conflict areas, you can get it in without militarizing it, can you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sarah. Maybe you could expand.
Yeah, well, now that I've been cited as being from one of the few intellectual groups for the humanitarian industry, I'm just going to solve the problem right now.
Are these two on opposite sides, or are they?
They're not on opposite sides at all, because they start from the viewpoint that we have a system. And when we say a system, this isn't something that people went out and tinkered with and designed. This is something that's really just developed organically, and it is a messy system. And I think that was really evident in how Linda described it. We've got NGOs, we've got the United Nations, we've got coordination systems within the United Nations trying to coordinate the NGOs. We've got donors, we've got the non-DAC donors, so the non-traditional donors, and it is absolutely a system that for its noble ambition to help people is one that came about very haphazardly, and that those of us in the thinking part of it, have been really one of the big questions is, how do you work within the system? Unless you're talking about dismantling the idea of states, dismantling the idea of governments, how do you work within the system as it is? What can you change? What can't you change? So just the starting point is that this is absolutely, as they say, it's a messy picture. Then we operate in environments that have some of the most complex political, economic dynamics, power dynamics. And when you put that together, if we all thought that these kind of books couldn't be written, I mean, I think we'd really be kidding ourselves. But where they do have some common ground is the importance of looking at the idea of neutrality. But they come across completely differently, and this is a huge issue. Linda has been portraying neutrality as, I believe she describes it as a shield that aid workers can use to essentially do whatever, or I'm sorry, that absolves them from moral responsibility. An example in the book is essentially that if the Nazis called humanitarian workers, they would have to go into a camp and they would have to help them. And this is actually completely diametrically opposed to the idea that neutrality actually is something that's been completely, if not compromised, has gone through these phases where actually humanitarian agencies, in their desire to help people, have compromised or have called for humanitarian interventions. And so I find it fascinating that we're actually talking about,
isn't it? I mean, it's full of Amani, I know
the same issues. So.
Sorry, you've read Linda's book. You've looked at it. We've looked at, it seems that sort of a big mess, unstructured mess. How can it be fixed? Is Linda accurate on that, or?
Oh, how can it be fixed?
Well, let's do the accuracy, and then whether there's a way through, because we're hearing all things that are going wrong here, and whether there's anything that can put it right.
Yeah, can I just make a few comments first to Linda? Thank you, and thanks, Conor, and Frontline, everyone, for being here. I read your book, Going to Work, on the tube, and I nodded my head off in bits of it, recognized, identified, and in bits of it I was shouting out loud in the tube, come on, Linda, no, really. So if, you know, I get sectioned under the new Mental Health Act, Linda, you will hear from me. But from what you were saying, Sarah, there is a system, there is something, there is an entity out there, but honestly, it is not a system. And to talk about the aid industry, I think, is in itself problematic. That there is an aid out there, the planet aid, where there is a structure and things happen in a structured way. And to group organizations, you know, to group humanitarian aid agencies, to group UNICEF with CARE, Action Aid, Oxfam, the Pentecostalists, Islamic Relief, Aga Khan, and Khidmat. I mean, no, it doesn't exist. That is not the reality of the world out there. And it is not helpful to group them together. I do not think it is helpful to speak about the humanitarians and about aid. Again, the specific image of aid that is being discussed in the book and discussed generally when we say aid, I think there is an implicit worldview of a benevolent white West, always, giving to disaster-stricken, poor, mostly passive recipients of aid, and I'll pick that up on the change of, you know, whether when we put aid in a situation we're increasing conflict, we're changing dynamics. We're changing dynamics. If we were thirsty and someone came in here with a box of water, we'll change the dynamics. It will not necessarily increase conflict. It will change dynamics. But back to that, this white West is giving to the East or South, wherever you come in the political ideological spectrum, and I am coming from the Southeast here, because we're passive recipients of this aid, and the West is either giving it benevolently or giving it because it has a hidden agenda, usually both. And somehow implicitly in all our discussion of aid, that is the image. And one of the problems I have with the book is that in a reverse way, by criticizing this very image, it is maintaining the Western supremacy that the West is giving the recipients of aid. So that is something I just find problematic. And this is, by the way, may have been true to a great extent and in particular contexts, but there are also other aid organizations there that, I don't know, that do not do aid as portrayed, in that we go in and we go out and we give immediate assistance. So for example, we as Action Aid do not do aid as a charity. We do not do aid only to alleviate immediate needs. We only do humanitarian assistance if it is going to ensure long-term sustained rights for the people in question, the affected communities, which is back to the question of neutrality. In fact, neutrality, as it is written in the humanitarian law, is a very fluid, it's a very loose cloak, really, and it's been interpreted, it has been interpreted really differently by different organizations. We interpret neutrality as an organization as we do not take sides with the government or the warring factions, but we also take sides with poor people, and we operate on a rights-based approach. And we do not go in and out quick and dirty. If we do not operate in an area and do not have a program in an area, we do not operate there. And you know, I'm very happy to say that we're not unique. There are other organizations who do that.
I just want to come back to Linda for a second on this, and then if on this idea of the aid industry, it's a very good point. You separated everything off and said that it's not the same, it's not the same. But when we, the public, look at a G20 meeting or a Millennium Group, it is X billion being promised for the developing world over such and such a period. So is it an industry, Linda, or is it separated off into different sections, as Amani said?
Well, even the Dutch Minister of Development Aid calls it an industry. And I mean, he knows something. But it is an industry because there are market mechanisms there. It is a flow of money for which several organizations, and I call them businesses, aid organizations, for which several organizations do bids. For example, you are bidding on contracts of the donors. You have to be better, you have to be quicker, you have to be more interesting than competing organizations. So in that way, the aid business is in fact the same as any other business. You are answering to the same marketing laws as other businesses.
You're nodding.
So it is an industry, and it is a growing industry too. I mean, aid organizations are often complaining about donor fatigue, for example. It's not true. Budgets are growing every year, and the amount of aid organizations are still growing every year, which means that the competition is getting bigger every year.
Is it a good industry or a bad industry?
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, I think certainly it is an industry, and I think there are different brands within that. You have Marks and Spencers, and you have Waitrose, and so on. And then you have very small organisations. I think one of the good chapters in Linda's book was on the Mongos, my own NGO, where people set up their own little group and sort of say, I'm going to get the aid where the people need it. I'm going to cut out the overheads, ensure that I'm going to give them what they really need. And I remember being in Sri Lanka where people trucked over mini skirts and woolly jumpers to hand out to people because they didn't want to give money to an aid organisation because they'd spend it on overheads and staff and whatever. And so obviously the people were very happy to get these woolly mini skirts and woolly jumpers, and they burnt them, which they use them for cooking fuel. And that's a classic thing that a lot of the United States government subsidises its farmers by far, 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 far more than they give in foreign aid. And with all this excess food at the end of it, they don't know what to do with all this excess food that they paid to be produced, and which incidentally puts African farmers out of business. So they give it to WFP, who ship it over and distribute it as famine relief in places like Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, DRC, where it does wreck local economies. So I think the aid industry can do harm, can do great harm. And
is it scrutinised enough? I mean, you've got an industry, and any industries with their pinstripe suits and their bank accounts, that Linda's saying, comes under extreme scrutiny. Is the aid industry scrutinised?
I think the aid industry definitely has a lot of soul searching, and it's starting to make more progress along accountability. I mean, essentially after the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, that was a really critical moment for the aid industry that led to the development of industry-wide standards, sphere standards, response codes of conduct about how to behave in these areas. And now 10 years on, or more than that, there's a group even based out of ODI that is actually working on industry-wide state of the system benchmarks to measure how is the industry performing in terms of effectiveness, efficiency, accountability. And actually those are the things that obviously aren't really making headlines. Other developments, Conor was just speaking about the fact that inappropriate food aid can wreck local markets. What about all the advances in the last 5 years for distributing cash? Now that is becoming a more common way of simply giving money to people so that they can buy what they need, that turns this entire notion of passive recipients right on its head. I was just working with 7 NGOs around addressing corruption risks and tackling corruption. It's a tricky subject. It's going to take a long time to do. But the fact that Transparency International just came out with standards on corruption and humanitarian assistance is one. No, but you can do all of this. You can have the best standards in the entire world. We could probably teach agencies how to really combat corruption risk. Does not change the fact that these are complex environments where we cannot expect aid to do something that it simply cannot do. We often attribute way too much power, and I think that's actually a criticism I have of Linda's work. We assume that aid is that we assume that we're the biggest, we're the only factor, that it's because of us that everything, that all the wheels turns and the sun rises and the sun sets. Is that what you were saying,
Imani, there, about the Western?
Let me first qualify. I did not say it is not an industry. That yes, there are markets as in market forces, but it is not a monolith out there, and there is a lot of pressure on organizations to work as competitors in competition, and we suffer from that, for example, and all organizations. But we cannot claim that they're all the same and that they're just brands of a business.
But should they be policed the same? Should they be accountable of the same values?
Let me get to this. Accounted to the same values? Of what?
Rather like business.
Well, the only value in business is if you're making money.
Okay, what's the value in aid?
Exactly, that is the million-dollar question. What is, that is the million-dollar question. The only value is in business is, am I making, it's easy. And I am not, by the way, here defending the aid industry, but as Sarah said, acknowledging that as an industry, as a profession, actually. I think we need to look at it as a profession. But it does have people who are very professionals and professional organizations who are professional, and the stereotypical sandal-wearing, tree-hugging bohos going, with woolen jumpers, bless them, and mini skirts and what have you, to 40 degrees Celsius, bless.
The aid angels.
Yeah, well, it happens. It does happen, but it is also an industry where any do-gooder, where you and I can just decide tomorrow to become humanitarians. Who's there to prevent us? And there is also the question is, should they be prevented?
Let's see. I want to take some questions on this.
You know, just the human right to sit down. There's about 4 or 5 seats at the front here if people want to come in.
Oh. I'd just like to take a couple of questions on this concept of the industry, and then I want to move on and talk about corruption within that industry. Is anybody over here? Yep.
This is probably a very naive question.
Can you say who you are?
Well, actually, I should declare my interests. My name is Mary Mount, and I am the publisher of War Games.
Right.
And obviously, I've Well, no, I published it because I feel very strongly about this subject. And having read it, obviously, very closely, my key sort of question, and it's obviously a very naive question, is about competition. Because as far as I was concerned, I thought Linda's book was not about either we let people die or we let them live. It was about why do these aid organizations have to compete? If the ultimate aim is to save lives, shouldn't they be working together? And she uses a very good example of Médecins Sans Frontières with this terrific report on their own work in Afghanistan, where they acknowledge, as Conor has talked about, how impossible it is to detach aid from the military situation. And yet, they couldn't withdraw, because if they withdrew, somebody else would come in.
But they did withdraw.
Well, they withdrew for a moment, but essentially
they're still gone.
Okay, hold on.
Well, what I'm basically saying is in various situations, I would say that charities or aid organizations do not withdraw because they know that somebody else will fill their place. And or there are several organizations attempting to do similar things in the same area, or essentially what I don't understand, I've never understood, long before I ever published a book on the subject, is why there is not a different way of thinking in terms of how organizations can work together.
Sarah?
Well, I think it's important to point out, we mentioned the principle of neutrality, but the #1 guiding principle is the humanitarian imperative. Now, organizations like MSF, who do take political stances and will decide to withdraw, that's probably the exception, but the reason why organizations don't withdraw is because they have a humanitarian imperative to assist people. Now, the question becomes, are there scenarios where aid does more harm than good? How do you enable organizations to assess that? And that's actually something that we're working on with different NGOs, but it would be naive to think that they do not think about these questions. And it's also important to recognize that the driving force of humanitarian agencies, and this sounds very simplistic, but it's to help people who are affected by conflict who do not have oftentimes anything to do with what's going on around them. I'm sorry, did I miss the question entirely? What was it?
The question is specifically, and I think we've all seen this in the field, that you can go to an obscure place and the local government official will bring out a sheet of paper with 20 or 30 aid agencies on it, all doing the same thing, all registered there. Why are they competing with each other when the purpose is to save lives?
No, that's a good question.
Linda. Linda. Oh, no, you're the one that raised it. Conor.
Oh, it's
Okay, no, I'd agree. In fact, on my way here, I stopped off to get some money out of my cash point. And when I put my card in, thing flashed up on my screen. You can donate money to Haiti for the Disaster Emergency Committee. Now, one thing I'll agree with Linda on, if you want to give money to humanitarian assistance, don't give it to Haiti. I mean, they can't spend the money. And if a disaster like tsunami comes up, don't give it to tsunami. MSF, great. I mean, MSF, there's people from MSF here, aren't there? Yeah? They're really irritating, MSF, but because they're so often right, and they always let you know afterwards. One of the great things MSF did after tsunami was they just wrote to all their supporters and said, look, we can't spend the money. You've given us far too much money. And so we're actually going to spend it in, was it Niger? Another crisis, or maybe Chad. And they said, you know, that's it. The problem for aid organizations, and yes, it is an industry, is you get money from being in places. And organizations say, we go in there, yes, we know we're duplicated, and we'll use it to cross-subsidize our other activities.
Without telling the public often.
The basic way in which relief organizations happen, I spend quite a bit of it about this in the first chapters in my book. I think aid is an industry, and I think aid agency, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The industry is saving lives. And unfortunately, it is my own organisation. The mongers exist. The bigger agencies are getting more professional, but being more professional actually means, you know, evaluations, consultants, industry standards, checking. I've just come back from an assessment I did, evaluation I did for the EU in Angola as a consultant, and then people say, oh, why are you spending all this money on consultants' fees? I mean, and this is the argument. They say, why you have all these aid organisations? They're all very young, but they earn so much more money than the locals. Actually, typical aid agents.
I want
to get onto that afterwards on corruption. Can we, Amani, just to hit on that point, why do they compete?
No, I really want to say something.
And then you come back.
Well, there is pressure for organizations to compete, but again, I'm not, the idea that we're all competing for the same thing. Yeah, it's competing for resources, but for example, the Mongo is not competing for action aid, and actually they're very upfront. Some of the Pentecostalists are upfront, and I saw them in Kenya, as to why they're there. And they have a stream of funding that they're not competing with us. The industry, as in grants, for example, when we're competing with other organizations for grants, if we are competing for grants, yes, there is a pressure to compete. And yeah, you're right, to an extent, sometimes we just need to say, you know what, sorry, we're not doing that. But there are organizations doing this. We have a list of donors we do not accept money from. They approach us, we do not accept money from these donors, no matter what. And even individual donors, we just return it. Sorry, we don't.
Yes, but you do accept from other donors. So I mean,
Yeah,
that's entirely up to you to decide which donor you accept and which donor you do not accept. I have a strong objection against this humanitarian imperative thing. That means that humanitarian organizations have this duty to go wherever there is suffering, and they have this duty to relieve that suffering, no matter what the consequence is, no matter what the context is. I mean, we are talking here about private businesses, private organizations that call themselves humanitarian and are therefore suddenly above this law. You know, they can go and they can hand out money and they can hand out goods without being accountable for where the money ends up. Does it end up in the pockets of warlords? Is your money ending up in some war chest? Is it being exchanged for guns? That's entirely up to these organizations to decide where to go and to whom to give this money to. We can all decide tonight to start an NGO, and the only thing we need is money, and then we go to Africa and we do with that money whatever we want. But what gives us that right to do that? There is no academy for humanitarians. You don't need diplomas, you don't even need a special knowledge about the area where you're going. It's all up to you. You are a humanitarian organization, and that gives you the right to decide who you are giving money and who you are not giving money.
What was the point you made in your book that struck me? I think the way you said that if a corrupt government doesn't like the conditions laid down by one aid agency, it can now then go to another one. And
of course, I mean, of course it is like that. Of course it is like that, and it's getting worse because now we have China on the aid market too. I mean, now there's this big unrest in Brussels, where the EU is constantly being confronted with China. You know, if the EU has too many demands on corrupt African regimes, they will just say, well, in that case, we will look to the east, meaning we will then get the money from China. Of course, it works like that.
Just at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name's James Steele. I'm a novelist with HarperCollins. I'm just wondering if you could go back to the issue of liberal interventionism. You all seem to be agreed that NGOs are sort of inefficient and the industry could work better, but do you support the idea of liberal interventionism? Do you support the idea of military going into situations to reduce chaos and anarchy, which would allow agencies to operate more effectively because they're not in a lawless environment? And the examples, sort of things like the British action in Sierra Leone, which sort of pretty much finished off the civil war there, and things have got a bit more positive. Well, yeah, okay, all right, but things got a bit more positive. Do you support that kind of action?
Could we just put that question on hold, because that's one that I want to do after we've done corruption, because that's basically what Conor's book is about. We just take one more from here.
Yes, I think it's an overriding question that should be asked. And the overriding question is very simple. AIDS agencies go in. Why do they go in and why do they compete? Number one, what makes a person want to be in an aid agency? Is it moral responsibility in looking at those that are suffering and saying, I want to do something that I have the power? And all of us, not maybe all of us, in terms of moral responsibility. And then in the broader scope of what you're saying is you have 20 AIDS agencies in one area, and they're all competing against each other. Well, we have 20 drinks agencies out there in the business world competing as well for different niche markets, for different flavors, for different positioning within the market. And competition is not a negative thing at all. What it does, and it can do, is stimulate excellence. And I see nothing, and I work in conflict areas and terrible areas as a photojournalist. And I see corruption with AIDS agencies, I see money on the backhander, and there's all sorts of things that are going on. But at the end of the day, the question asked, all of you sitting here, and probably many in this audience, is why are you involved in the AIDS business, the AIDS industry? Is it moral responsibility? Saying, I want to help someone else, and that's the reason I do that, rather than see how much money I can make as a banker and a politician.
So in your view, the competition is a good thing?
I think competition can encourage excellence in no matter what business you are, whether you are in politics and what we're going on right now with the Great British Political Beauty Contest, which I have no comment about, whoever is going to win that contest, straight through to any kind of industry that you can talk about as commercial and traded in the international markets, into the AIDS agencies that go in and try to say, we want to take some moral responsibility. Médecins Sans Frontières, and I've seen their work, is astonishingly wonderful, as are many from Save the Children and certainly with UNICEF. But at the end of the day, I don't think there is anything negative, and I open the question, to encourage competition amongst AIDS agencies, depending on what they're doing. You don't want to see 30 AIDS agencies with a bunch of kids with their laptops that don't know one end of the, and they're there for their gap year. That, I think, is corruption.
Can I comment on that?
Total corruption.
Yeah, just very quickly, yes.
Okay, yes, well, yes, it can stimulate towards excellence, but it can also mean that aid organizations don't dare to make a moral choice anymore, because if they make a moral choice of not aiding somewhere, then the competition will do that. So what's the point of you making a moral choice if it doesn't change anything? So this competition makes aid agencies vulnerable to manipulation and to blackmail. And that is what is wrong with competition in the aid industry.
Conor, can we just take you, then I just want to move on to that point.
Sure, I disagree with that, Linda's point there. And I also don't think that the issue about competition, or indeed many different organisations coming in, is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, actually donors hold the keys to the gate. The amount of money that is coming from individual collections is pretty small. It's governments, it's the UN agencies that have the big budgets. And organisations that are in the field, when I was in everywhere I've worked, the amount of money that we got from headquarters was quite small. We were picking up grants from UN agencies and bilateral donors, and they decide. And it doesn't matter actually if you've got 5, 6, 7 NGOs in an area. I mean, there's enough wells to be dug, there's enough schools to be thinking. And you specialise. Oxfam will do Watsan, Save the Children do education, NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council, sets up legal aid projects. So it's not actually that much. I think what is the case is that some areas attract huge amounts. You know, Haiti at the moment, Kosovo back then, the tsunami, Sri Lanka and Indonesia. One of the criticisms I have of Linda's book is she spends far too much time in those places, actually with the aid workers and the journalists. I kept turning the page thinking we were going to get out in the field, but it was, you know, back in another bar and the journalist saying this, the aid worker saying that. But there's actually, out there in the field, it's the places that don't attract the attention. When I spent 6 months in northern Uganda, which got virtually nothing. And we had more people died in the displacement camps in northern Uganda in 2005, 2006 than were dying in Darfur, because we weren't getting the aid. So all the aid was going across the border to Darfur because that got the attention. That was the CNN factor there, I agree with you. But it's not so much that you have lots of agencies coming in and being all inefficient. It's that some crises attract far more of the media attention and therefore far more money. But what do you do about it? You can't stop people giving money to aid.
Yeah, but I really have to say something here. It's as if aid agencies are not doing, I don't know which aid agencies we're talking about. You know, there are the multi-mandated, there are the MSF and ICRC.
We're talking about the industry as a whole.
No, you can't. That's my point, Humphrey. You cannot. There is there is an industry as in market mechanism. Linda's point. There is no monolith. No, you can't. But also the other thing, you know, I'll leave. It seems that there is this assumption of, oh, the small NGOs rushing around there. There is a huge policy operation, back to your point, that most of the grants come from governments and institutional donors, aid agencies, the aid agencies that I know and worked with, and I'm not here defending that there are huge shortfalls, but also are doing a lot of policy work to influence, you know, how funding mechanisms go, how funding streams go. They start working in consortia. So, you know, the idea that aid agencies are nothing but service providers who are going out there to do tents, there is also a lot of policy work and policy arm to aid agencies. And again, which there is an aid industry, as in mechanisms of markets, to use Linda's word. It is not a monolith. Huge difference.
I just want to, what I'd like, there's a couple of questions here, but I want to ask another question to the panel. Take those questions and then we'll play that. I mean, we've got an election going on here at the moment with all these parties competing, but the aid budget to Britain is locked. So one thing they agree about £6 billion is going out, and it must be the only industry, for want of a better word, that I know of, where you know what's being spent, but you don't actually see the result of it. How much of that money that leaves the taxpayers in this country or any other country gets to the ground where it's needed, and how much gets siphoned off, and how does it get siphoned off? Let's just get a few questions fed in. One at the back there.
My name's Philip Truitt. I'm, until recently, an investigator with the United Nations, looking into corruption in development projects and in peacekeeping operations. And so this is all pretty relevant. The one thing I wanted to say is
that'd be useful.
The scandal, to my mind, is not that corruption happens. If you put a pile of money there with loose rules, people are going to take it. The scandal is that nothing's done about it. I mean, the reaction within the UN is fundamentally denial and then attack. And I've been threatened with arrest and dismissal by senior UN officials for doing investigations, which is in line with our policy. And then we have these lovely big governance action plans, which are never followed. And so when various organizations come and ask for money, it's very difficult for me to actually say yes. I mean, I don't give any money to Haiti or to the tsunami, and not because I don't care, because I went into this business because I do care. It's because I don't know where it goes. And nobody's doing anything about it, within the UN certainly. And so actually I think these books, whether you agree with every point or not, at least we are asking people questions that very definitely need to be asked.
Let's just take that and then we'll come back on that. Investigate and then get threatened and nothing happens. Let's, can we just, question here.
Hi, I'm Sandrine from British Red Cross. So obviously I have to give the Red Cross point of view on all of this. I mean, just wanted to mention, sorry, I know you're talking about corruption, but I just want to quickly go back to the issue of the humanitarian imperative. I mean, I know I don't want to sound like a bore here, but we have the Geneva Conventions, and in the Geneva Conventions, which are a legal framework for a war situation, so not talking about peacetime and development issue, which is another story, but during wartime, especially the Red Cross, but other agencies have the mandate to alleviate suffering for people who are civilians who are not taking part in hostilities. So it's not, the humanitarian imperative isn't just, you know, people deciding, oh, let's go and do good, although there are some people who think that too. Also, there are local, we have, in the Red Cross movement, we have local Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, and they have a legal obligation, often by their government, to undertake various tasks in disaster relief, emergency relief. So I think it's a little bit difficult to generalize about that point. I think also on the issue of competition, I think we have two things that affect us in the field. One is that the needs can be tremendous. I mean, the needs in Haiti are just way beyond any of, and there's a lot of money going there, and none of us can solve half of the problems there. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to actually be able to say we can make a difference when you don't have a functioning state. You know, I mean, we can build pipes, but who's going to maintain them? I mean, they're just, this is one of the real difficulties, is that we're sort of patching up a difficult situation. Sorry, I'll just finish on the last point.
More. If we let you through on this, we'll just have to
yeah, and the last point is just about the push that we have, because our donors are not only governments, but also people who want change and have a desire to assist. And so often we're put into positions where we're given lots of money for things that maybe don't require that much money.
Okay, the key, okay, you've had your say. Give us in a nutshell, how much money going through the Red Cross goes missing through corruption?
That's the real question.
That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, we have the most stringent.
No, it really isn't much.
You don't publish that figure?
No, we don't have
you
evidence
don't have any money going missing on corruption?
Huge,
okay, it's not a huge problem.
significant
not
corruption.
Huge, not huge. So how does it, because who was it, you were in northern Uganda, weren't you? Because I was up there quite recently, and the figure that I got around there was 70 or 80% sort of just vanishes of the actual source money. What would you say on that?
Well, we're talking about humanitarian assistance rather than general budget assistance. So humanitarian assistance, money that aid organisations like, say, the Red Cross or MSF or CARE or Save the Children, in northern Uganda, I would say it would be very, very low, because they can actually, you know, part of my job was you do the budget at the beginning of the year, you count the things in, you plot them up, you've got under enormous pressure from your own headquarters. So, you know, I can put my hand on my heart and say virtually no money that I was ever aware of we lost through corruption in, I would say, half a dozen conflict zones. And that includes places like Afghanistan and Liberia, which are amongst the most corrupt countries in the world. The money, you can get it in. There are examples, certainly in Somalia, in Bosnia, in conflict zones where people are having money taken from them. But I mean, Linda's book
you wrote a piece about aid in Afghanistan and how it was bribing people and it wasn't working.
Yeah, that's true. I'm actually,
so you're going against your own argument there, or? No,
in fact, two things. One, I'm currently being sued for something I did in for the Guardian on an NGO, and it's the subcontracting system where in this case, the Italian government gave money through the EU to the UN, who subcontracted an NGO, subcontracted someone else, and it seemed that the money got less and less and less, and the actual hospital that got built at the end didn't seem to be worth the amount of money that went in at the beginning. And I wrote a piece about that, which unfortunately there's now a writ against me for. So I can't say anything more about that.
Is that the point that we got up there, that you're just being silenced and threatened on?
Oh yeah, no, of course. In fact, I've also been threatened physically by the head of the Afghan Red Crescent Society with a gun. He's a warlord.
Threats, Linda, threats and corruption. Threats and corruption.
Mafia. It's a mafia. Well, I mean, what I'm hearing here is the amount being diverted, or the amount we lose, or the amount being pocketed by corrupt, etc., is not huge, or I would say that, etc. We just don't know. We know of incidences. Like, for example, the United Nations was honest enough to admit that in the 90s on the Balkans, 30% of all UN aid was being pocketed by Serb warriors. You know, that's a lot of money. And MSF Holland recently did a research about how much MSF money was actually being stolen in Darfur at the moment. And they came to an amount of 5%, and they said there was a low estimate, and they said that's 5% of our money, which doesn't amount to a huge amount, but they said it's 5% of us, and it's 5% of all these other organizations that work there. And Darfur is one of the biggest aid operations in the world. So if you have a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars in Darfur, and 5% is disappearing, that is a lot of money. And we just don't know how much it is. Also now there's this big scandal of the World Food Programme in Somalia.
Can it be, please?
25 million is probably being pocketed by warlords. The report is there now at the Security Council. It could be a lot of money. We have to know. We have to start asking the questions, and we have to start doing the research and quantify and then analyze how bad the problem is. Because then we might feel the urgency to do something about it.
Sarah, this concept of money going missing, investigations taking place, threats being made, and nobody actually coming clean about it.
I mean, it's interesting that Linda mentions we should start doing the research because we did a 2-year study on corruption in humanitarian assistance.
Where is it?
I know what
it's
published.
published and it's available.
Give us the nutshell
Well, this is what I find really the tricky thing about corruption is the question that everyone asks is how much money is going missing from corruption. I would argue if you knew the answer to that, this corruption probably wouldn't be occurring. It's something that's related to power dynamics. It's something that's a hidden thing, and it involves a lot of players. And I think we become unnecessarily focused on amounts. Now, what I think the question should be is what can you do about it? And in a case like Somalia, where it's really much more diversion than corruption, there's a difference here. Corruption is essentially someone who has entrusted power.
It's money
diversion
disappearing.
Is something
Well, is it possible to get humanitarian aid through to starving people without having to pay off illicit organizations on the way? Do you have to be corrupt to make it work?
Well, that is my fundamental problem with the book. Sorry, Linda. It's all the same, money disappearing, money disappearing through because the structures are not working, through corruption, which is intent. It's money disappearing. Whereas it is true in that, and I hear the rage, and I agree and acknowledge it and honor your rage, but it is not helpful if we are, again, trying to see what can be done about it, to put it all under money disappearing, we're outraged. We need to look at how and why the money is disappearing.
Exactly.
So for example, the example that, is it Philip?
Well, it's corrupt governments, isn't it?
No, hold on. Let's not just banter around words. No, hold on. Corrupt performance means that people going out there, consciously wanting to make money out of that. And then there is, and it's no justification, by the way, for the money disappearing. But I think it is helpful to do some analysis. Again, I honor and acknowledge the rage, but to really deal with it, back to your question as to what to do, we need to look at the situation and the context. What to do with the situation of Central Emergency Relief Fund money getting, UN agencies getting cuts out of them is a very different context than the question you've just posed to me now, Humphrey, about, do you give money to warlords? Again, you haven't answered it. The question is we don't, all right? We wouldn't.
Even if there's a child starving at the other end?
Again, it's about how conflict sensitive you are. We believe that as aid agencies, we need to have a very good understanding and analysis of the situation we are going in. And it's up to you. We believe, that if we actually put more money into, in this particular context, it really depends on the context, into the warlords' hands, for example, it might lead to worse consequences. I will not pontificate. I'll give you an example of Pakistan. I've just been to Swat. In this particular context, the affected populations, we work with communities. We are part of the communities. I come from the third world myself, and basically, we asked people. There were markets functioning, for example. So the fact that we could not get food to affected populations, they will not starve. Markets were functioning. So the choice was, no, we're not going to cooperate with the Taliban, for example, as an organization that is advocating for a rights-based approach. We cannot really put a blanket, are we going to put money? In that case, I agree with you, Linda. We didn't. But there are cases where the choice may have been that we did. Again, a very different beast than the example that Philip introduced, not to justify it by any stretch of the imagination. It is different. It is not helpful to put it under money disappearing.
Just want to take a question in the...
Thanks. Hi, my name's Alex Jacobs. I work for an NGO. I used to work for Oxfam in Rwanda and the Congo in the late 90s. it feels like a big theme we've been discussing about is the tension between raising money and spending it effectively and ethically. And I really appreciate the way the debate is going a bit more nuanced, and that it's pretty difficult just to say aid agencies good or bad. What's the total percentage that's being pinched? It's not going to be helpful. But the question seems to be more, how do we help make aid better? And one of the things that seems partly coming out is that the level of that tension is felt within aid agencies themselves, and some certainly run after money, and some are really deeply anguished about the whole question of how to make aid better. And some of ActionAid's principled work has certainly led the field in ways that are very different, I think, perhaps in slightly different contexts, some of the issues in the books we're discussing. But certainly some of the agencies have come together, and if you forgive me, Nick Stockton was until a month ago, he was the director of an outfit called HAP, the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, which was a leading effort by agencies themselves to try to tackle the issue of corruption broadly and the issue of accountability by making aid agencies more accountable to the people they're trying to serve. It's work in progress, it's not taking over the whole sector, but it's movement in the right direction. I think it'd be great. We need to sort of honor that, those initiatives coming from within the sector itself.
Okay. I believe journalism can help move things along a bit quicker. I do believe that we have a responsibility to do that research, we as journalists, because I don't think that the self-cleansing ability of aid organizations is big enough to do the changes.
There's just a question there, and then I want to move on a little bit to...
I'm Cynthia Petrick. I work for Conciliation Resources. I have an innocent question. I'm not a publisher, but I've worked for many years in the humanitarian aid sector, so like some of the distinguished speakers you would call us war benefitor, maybe. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that I've been working for 17 years in the sector, and I've never witnessed corruption, or I've worked in many different places, including in war zones. I've witnessed a lot of mismanagement of money. For example, I think we are paying far too expensive somebody who's not competent, but I've never seen people putting money in their pocket, and I've never bribed anybody, and I think it probably exists, but I don't think it's as big a problem as, for me, would be, for example, the fact that much more of the aid is spent here than where we say it is spent. When we send money to Haiti or to Uganda or to Palestine or to wherever, I think a significant amount of this money is spent here on headquarters admin fees, on consultants, on shipping our own goods that we buy here, and I don't know if you would call
That's the
this
argument
corruption.
Of the recipient countries.
Yes, so I think a lot more money is spent here than I would say is lost on corruption. And my question is, I didn't read your book yet, and I'm going to read it, but I didn't get it. It's a lot of interesting comments, and I didn't understand if you think the whole sector is like useless and should disappear, or do you have ideas of how to make us more efficient or more accountable?
Well, the sector doesn't need my book. They know. They only have to implement what they themselves have thought about to at least improve the situation. So read the reports of the sector, read about all these codes of conduct that they've developed, about the hub that is there. About your work, the solutions have all been thought of. Well, at least there are ways to improve the situation a lot. The only thing that aid organizations have to do is to implement the rules that they themselves have thought of. They don't need me, they really don't.
I'd just like to just go around very quickly on the point here and the point there, because I found them quite contradictory. You don't think it's useful to come up with the figures of so much goes and this is this. Not single global figures, and you investigate these things quite intricately and find yourself threatened. So if you could very quickly, in a nutshell, is the aid industry too internal? Is it too defensive? Does it take criticism well? Can it reconstruct itself without outside help. And then I want to move on to the issue of humanitarian intervention, which we touched on. But on that one,
really, unhappy with the aid industry. Just have to say again.
You're happy with it?
Unhappy, very unhappy.
With
with your use of the aid industry. The aid industry, the aid industry, the
well,
aid
I'm unhappy
industry.
with the use of media, but I accept it.
Yeah, but you know, so yeah, I just have
So you're not answering it, Conor?
I'm not, but I'm just saying that
okay,
first
fine.
I am.
Conor?
The aid industry, sorry, is the most, it is one of the most dangerous, humanitarian aid professionalism is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. I don't actually remember how many of my friends and colleagues have been killed in the last 5 years. I remember one time in Afghanistan going to the funeral of a friend and colleague, and that afternoon making a presentation to a donor as to why a new project should be set up in another part of the country. Of course, aid organisations are defensive in one sense. Linda chose, in my opinion, quite personalised. Her article in her chapter in Afghanistan was, I think, quite shocking. What you said, some things which were blatantly untrue, and you made comments about what aid workers do. You made comments about the fact that we don't take care of our local staff. You said that we don't train our beneficiaries on safety. You had a bizarre comment about us going off to a Thai restaurant with women in split miniskirts and suspenders. All of that is just completely untrue. And no, Linda, I can tell you, it is completely untrue what you said. I personally trained my staff in 2004. You said it didn't happen until 2008. That's just not true. So when people get attacked in those sorts of ways, with that kind of baggage that we carry, and also not very well informed. I mean, you say the ODI report on corruption, but you don't reference it. There's a reference to giving cash, how cash aid can be used. That's a massive thing to talk about how it's changing the dynamics of the industry. Humanitarian accountability, I didn't see anything. There's a reference to the sphere principles, but very little. The dynamics of justice and peace, your discussion of the International Criminal Court, your discussion of Darfur, your use of massively inflated figures for the casualties in Darfur. So I think it's great to have this debate, and it's great to have a book that brings this debate to the fore, but I think you could have done a bit deeper. There could have been more research.
I invite everybody to go deeper. We desperately need more research. We desperately do. Yeah.
Sarah, just to get back, can the aid industry reform itself, or is it going to need outside policing and help to do it? Well, not people, not organisations funded by the aid industry. Is it going to need a completely different...
I mean, it depends on the idea of reform. There are lots of reforms going on, whether it's ones related to humanitarian accountability, adoption of standards, or even around coordination. But I think the question was quite interesting about defensiveness and even things around figures. And I met with someone who from the World Food Program after the diversion in Somalia related to a different subject, because I'd written a blog where I basically I pointed out how hard it is to do food aid in Somalia. And I think the fact that the dialogue becomes one of attack and defensiveness, it's both sides of it. Now, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that the media should not be vigilant and play a role in this, but I was a bit alarmed by this sort of this gung-ho, maybe the media should be the one to out them, just because if we're going to move on with issues around diversion, it is going to be incredibly complex and it's going to be nuanced. And when I get more media inquiries about corruption and assistance than I get on any other work that we do, because that's one that people seize on. And in the cycle of attack and defensiveness isn't going to help anyone. So I think that on the one hand, aid agencies should be better about dealing with it. They should be more open about what occurs. But on the other hand, it is such a double-edged sword, because publicly admitting that you have an acceptable level of you are perfectly okay with 15 to 20% of your aid going missing in Somalia, but not with 50%, it's something that would just be so controversial that they don't want to open themselves up to it.
Okay. I want to move on to Conor's theme now. We'll announce the theme, take a couple of questions on it, hopefully, and then go around. And it's really what we were talking about here, and that's the humanitarian intervention, the militarization of it, basically. When should it be done and when shouldn't it be done? If we go back and look at Rwanda, or Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, all have got decisions that political leaders have to make as to whether or not to go into a place and where we're going to go from here. Has anybody got any points to make on that before we go to the panel? Yep, just. I don't want it to, no, because otherwise we'll get into a huge row about miniskirts and Thai restaurants. And but so you haven't got a, yep, there's, okay, we'll go there and then back to the panel.
My question isn't exactly on that, but I want to put this point because I'm afraid it might not be dealt with, and you know, then we'll all go, is the difference between humanitarian aid and human rights. I would like to ask the panel maybe after this whether they think NGOs who do protective accompaniment, that kind of thing, whether in fact that's a way that would be better to deal with a lot of crises rather than pumping in humanitarian aid. People do a protective accompaniment. They help local organizations to be able to do the work themselves. I'd also just like to make one comment, because I heard on the radio the other day a discussion in which one New York lawyer was saying that humanitarian aid blurred political objectives because, for example, in the case of the Palestinian occupation of Palestine, that it stopped the Palestinians understanding they were the defeated people. So I'd like you to address that as well.
Can we just take the one, if you're very quick, we'll take the two and then come to Conor on this.
Hi, sorry, just coming back to the liberal intervention thing and picking up on the chap there, sorry, I can't remember your name. The point there is he's saying that everybody's in favour of the aid industry and we all want to make it work better. And the question is, you know, is the best way of doing that simply by getting a more law-abiding, lawful environment that you're operating in, i.e. through having a military presence there so that you're not having to pay off warlords? Is that the way forwards on this?
Yep.
I just had a question really for Conor and Sarah, but maybe for the rest of the panelists as well, about how interventions like provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan and the US government and British government's approach to dealing and mitigating conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq has maybe colored the way that NGOs deal with the US government or deal with the British government in places like Congo and Sudan. And in terms of specifically the division between civilian and military responses to conflict, the US government is ratcheting up its responses in Congo and sending out more deployments and resources from AFRICOM, and the NGO community's instinct is a knee-jerk response to say that, no, we don't want any of that. And that's mainly colored from experience in Afghanistan. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay. Conor, could you just sort of encapsulate? I think that human rights question actually can be wrapped into the whole envelope on the moral element of what you wrote about, and political element of intervention.
The owner of the Thai restaurant in question is actually a good friend of mine. To deal with the 3 points, the accompaniment, yes. Peace Brigade International are the most well-known organisation that do it. In Colombia, I've come across them working in Colombia, Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste, and in all 3 cases they've actually been more effective than you would think. Having said which, and I think to come back to your point, a central point of my book is the question, the legality of humanitarian intervention. And this is the point where Linda and I have my criticism, particularly of her chapter on Afghanistan, but I mean, I'm acknowledging there's a debate that we're having about this, on which there's 2 sides. As MSF famously said when they pulled out of Rwanda during the genocide, one cannot stop a genocide with medicines. And that's the case. There will be cases where humanitarian aid simply will make no difference. The well-fed dead of Srebrenica was the other very well-known aphorism within humanitarian circles, where aid was used to encourage people to stay in the so-called safe havens, yet there was not the political will by the UN Security Council to defend those safe havens when they came under attack by the Bosnian Serbs. So the central dilemma for me, and that's what the book is about, is that threshold. Under international law, it's only permissible to use force in 2 circumstances. One is self-defense. You come under an armed attack, as the US did on 9/11, then you have the right to take military action in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The second permissible exception is when you've got a UN Security Council mandate to do that. And there are very large number of UN Security Council mandated peacekeeping missions in various parts of the world. And that's really the answer, I think, to Linda's point, is what do you do when you can't get aid in without paying off the militias? Well, that's the circumstances where you say, actually, well, we want the UN Security Council to send in a peacekeeping mission, because the only way in which we can feed the people, because the militias are terrorizing them, is if we've got some blue helmets on our backs with guns, because that's the only way we can do it. The history really of that type of humanitarian intervention is roughly 20 years. It goes, well, possibly less actually. It starts with the establishment of the safe haven in the Kurdish areas of northern Iraq at the end of the Gulf War. It went to Somalia, where because of the theft of aid by militia groups like humanitarian groups like CARE, the International Rescue Committee, Oxfam and others lobbied for military intervention as a mechanism for delivering aid. As people will probably remember, with the Black Hawk Down incident, it went disastrously wrong, became known as a shoot to feed, and the UN mission pulled out, and the Americans refused to put any ground troops into future peacekeeping missions, up to and including the Kosovo intervention, where they just bombed from the air. And really the history of humanitarian interventions was very much marked by that over that 10 to 15 year period. Rwanda, the Americans lobbied very, very hard against giving a strong enough mandate for a UN military presence capable of preventing the genocide, and also lobbied against putting enough troops there, because it happened, the mandate was being discussed in October 2003 at exactly the same time as the Black Hawk Down incident that occurred in Somalia. At the same time in Haiti, the Americans refused to land troops. In fact, Papa Doc's supporters met them on the landing quay, chanting the name of, about the victories in Somalia, and chanting, now Aidid had stopped them, Aidid had stopped them, and the US pulled back. That turned, out of that frustration by humanitarian aid agencies, who began to lobby increasingly for military interventions in certain circumstances. Oxfam, more or less, lobbied for military intervention in Kosovo, and some of the aid organizations lobbied for some more forcible military intervention in Bosnia. I was actually working at Amnesty International when we lobbied for the military intervention in East Timor in 1999, where eventually there was a UN-mandated intervention which stopped the killing spree that the militias had unleashed after the referendum vote. So it's complicated, and I don't think it's one or the other. It's for military intervention or it's not. There's a threshold, and there is a debate amongst kind of legal scholars about, is humanitarian intervention an exception to the prohibition of the use of force in international law? And some argue one, some argue the other. Tony Blair kind of destroyed that when he used humanitarian arguments to justify the invasion of Iraq, because bad and all of Saddam Hussein was, there wasn't an ongoing humanitarian crisis at the time. And the theory of liberal intervention, which I was a bit dismissive of earlier on, was, I think, a kind of post facto rationalization by Tony Blair to justify why, even without a UN Security Council authorization, he committed military forces to supporting the US invasion of Iraq. Because the invasion of Iraq was such a disaster, there's now no enthusiasm for future military interventions. And it's interesting, you know, since 2003, we saw a clear-cut case where there could and should have been military intervention was in Darfur in 2002, 2003. But the troops were in Iraq, and now they're in Afghanistan. There is a sizable military mission in the DRC, but compared to the need and compared to the tasks that it has, and it's clearly not enough. I think there's a debate. My preference would be where there are military interventions, and I think there are cases where they need to be, they should have a UN authorization. There is a problem, which is that two members of the Security Council, India, China and Russia, frequently veto that, and because they're permanent members, they have it. The most recent country I was working in was in Sri Lanka last year during the final assault on the LTTE stronghold in the north of the country. And for about 3 months, people will probably remember, there was upwards of 300,000 people trapped in an area about the size of New York Central Park, being bombarded night and day by the Sri Lankan government. And there was lobbying, quite limited lobbying, for international pressure to be put on the Sri Lankan government to open up a humanitarian corridor, to allow relief supplies in, to allow the evacuation of the wounded, and then to open up the camps in which they shipped the people who out of the war zone and put them into what were effectively concentration camps. And there was some pressure, and I think both the British and French governments played an admirable role in trying to pressurise the Sri Lankan government to open the camps. But with the support of China in particular, and Linda's right, China changes everything. The Sri Lankan government felt under no immediate pressure to do that.
Okay. Because it's nuanced, there's no hard rules. Amani, what's your view on this?
Well, I really appreciate what you said about the invasion of Iraq basically changed the rule of the game. If I'm very honest, I don't know, and we don't know. And it's not a new topic of debate, but it is a new situation, it is a new global context, it's a new world context, and we need to look at it, discuss it. No, to be honest, we really do not know. If I'm very honest about we don't know.
You don't know?
No, we don't know.
Sarah?
I mean, yeah, I could say principally, we say
we've got to do something, but we don't know how to do it.
Military intervention, and we would concur with what you were saying about, yes, if there is military intervention, it has to be by a UN Security Council. We as aid industry, I don't know, some of the aid industry that I know of at least, but because it's really different and contextual, are leaning towards more bounded and clear demarcation between civil humanitarian space and military intervention.
Sarah, it seems that after a lot of years after hearing this, there aren't enough rules, there aren't enough guidelines, there aren't enough benchmarks. Everything's done on the hoof.
For the industry or along?
No, there's no industry. It's also
Thank you.
On this thing of intervention. I mean, if Burma flares up tomorrow, is everybody going to start from a? Or do they go and look at guidelines on what should be done?
Yeah. Well, the question, this is where I'll point out that we actually did an opinion piece that's a response to Linda Polman's book, and I'm actually going to read this because this is where I'm going to play a humanitarian card. No, not the whole thing at all. But I'm going to say, influencing the course and conduct of conflict is ultimately the business of politicians, diplomats, and soldiers, not aid workers whose main concern is with the victims of conflict and abuse. And that's just to simply point out that coming from the Humanitarian Policy Group, I will say as an aid worker, we ask different questions, which is simply, how do we manage those relationships? How do we manage the results of it? And simply argue that it's not really our role to be the ones to influence it. Now, obviously, that's shifted, and there's been waxes and wanings of the extent to which humanitarians see that as part of the humanitarian imperative, and aid agencies do or don't advocate for different things. But I think that quote sums up my response.
Okay, I just want to take a couple of questions, and then we're just running out of time.
I'm Lydia Gomersall from the International Rescue Committee. I end up sounding like I'm pushing a lecture, which I put details out about, but it in fact leads straight on to a question, because the debate next month we're having is soldiers on the school run, sensible solution or disastrous compromise. And I wonder very much what the panel thinks about, not about military intervention, but when the military is there in a conflict zone, whether helping in the delivery of aid makes the whole situation worse or helps.
Okay, we just have one more question. Or are there no more? That's good, because we're running out of time. We're going to go around then finish with Linda. Can you just sum up? Does it help or hinder? Very quickly.
I'll give you what the people in Pakistan, when I was in Sawat, told me about that. It might have helped the delivery of aid in particular contexts, but what people said, that they actually did not appreciate it, because the relationship between the people and the military was fraught. They did not trust the military, and then it tarnished the whole aid community, as in we're all the same. As far as the Pakistan communities were concerned, all of us, all of the aid industry were either American spies or the Pakistan government. That's these are the things we need to weigh.
Is that an element?
Yes, in fact, it's good. It gives me an opportunity to come back about the PRTs in Afghanistan. There's two problems with it. One, it's very expensive. It's much more costly to use soldiers to deliver aid than to use aid workers, because of the logistic supply lines that are behind them. ODI did a very good paper on this just after Kosovo, because the military were very, you remember, during the bombing campaign, they started building refugee camps, and everyone thought, very good, soldiers efficient, military blah, aid workers, floppy, sandals, hippies, you know. But actually it turned out it was something like 10 times more expensive to construct refugee camps and to do most humanitarian aid work using soldiers than using aid workers. Secondly, it blurs the distinction, I mean, as has been said, and that was a particular problem in Afghanistan, where because basically the Americans didn't want to commit to nation building, so didn't want to put troops on the ground in Afghanistan, the troops were off in Iraq, the provincial reconstruction teams were created as a kind of stopgap measure, and it would be soldiers going out there with some civilian components, doing aid work and providing a visible military presence. I've got quite a bit about the PRTs in my book, and again, it's nuanced. The soldiers themselves sometimes did a great job. The British PRT, the New Zealand PRT, these were the people that we were, I mean, they were our friends, our colleagues, and because we had very little else, and we were up against some quite scary warlords, it was nice having them. But on balance, it was a disaster. MSF were very strong against it, and I think in balance, as ever, MSF were right.
Sarah, the people can read your opinions pieces on that side. Linda, can you just encapsulate your view of what we've all said here? Give us a punchy end.
A punchy end
to this debate.
The Thai restaurant.
Yes, and you are allowed to respond to the Thai restaurant allegations.
Was in fact visited and described in detail by the New York Times in 2001, just after the invasion. And it is, since then we are now, how much is it, 9 years later? The Thai restaurant has maybe been replaced, but I do know that there's now a pole dance club in Kabul where half-naked women are dancing also for NGOs.
So you didn't actually see it yourself? You just relied on a newspaper report. Okay.
The source is there.
You did see it yourself?
The source is there.
You did see it yourself?
No, she didn't.
The Thai restaurant, no, that's 2001.
Okay,
yes, I only went there in 2007. Pole dancing club is now in reports in Dutch newspapers.
And you've seen that yourself?
No, I didn't.
Okay,
no.
All right.
It should be, you say that it should be the responsibility of politics whether aid organizations can actually do their work without having to deal with the warlords. You know, what in the aid industry is called negotiated access. You have to deal with local authorities before you can actually get the permission to go in and work with the victims. It should be a matter of, it should be the responsibility of politics to provide the military assistance if that would be necessary. But there are so many places, the vast majority of places, where politics just don't take their responsibility. They prefer to ignore the problem, or they prefer to put the problem in the laps of the humanitarian organizations. You go, you know, we do something, we send aid, and you fix the problem with the local authorities. So in places where politics just refuse to take their responsibility, where they refuse to make the decision to send in the military to help get the aid to the victims, who will take responsibility there? The only ones there are humanitarian organizations. And I truly believe that aid organizations should take into account the context in which they work, and that they should be held responsible for the consequence of their aid. If aid is being abused and politics do not take their responsibility, then I'm afraid aid organizations will have to be held accountable for the consequence and for the abuse of that aid. Yes, I do believe that humanitarian aid organizations cannot be relieved of that responsibility, of that accountability.
The responsibility and accountability. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Amani Abizaid, Conor Foley, Sarah Bailey, and Linda Polman. Can you just give them a round of applause?